was a whirlwind relationship. We were at bars 5-6 nights a week. We had a lot of fun. We used to go out and play darts and shoot pool every night. I never meant for her to get hurt. I loved her. My name's Charles Thompson. I've been on death row for 18 years, 19 years altogether on this case. I was convicted of capital murder, double murder statute, and it was girlfriend and another man. How's that? Hear me good? Okay. Now I can hear better. I first met Denise on my birthday. There was a little chemistry right away. We sat around and drank some beers and got to talking. You know, we just hit it off. I had spent the night with her that night. In a matter of 2 weeks later, I moved in with her. She was always smiling, always laughing, just carefree. She had been divorced and she was 38 years old and having all the fun she missed out on. That's what she used to say. The lady could shoot pool, she could shoot darts, and she was the life of the party. Here I was, 27 years old, you know, and I thought she hung the moon. I was in love with her. We had a couple spats. There was one time, St. Patrick's Day, she hit me and I hit her, and I regretted it, man, I regretted it. You know, I was drunk and she hit me and I just lost my temper and slapped her a couple times. She had a black eye and I think her lip was bruised. Yeah, it was part of my case records too. That's nothing I was proud of. It's the first time I'd ever hit a woman in my life. We were very much in love and very much back together when this happened. And the prosecution tried to portray me as a disgruntled ex-boyfriend. That was not the case. My first inclination that she was seeing Darren was when she told me the weekend before this case happened that she went and slept with the bartender at Kelly's. I had met him several times, but I never had a clue that he was seeing my girl. And I should have snapped when we were in the bar. He was giving us free rounds of drinks, and it didn't occur to me, you know, why. I just thought wow, this guy's being really cool to us, you know. Apparently she'd been in there for lunch several times and was already seeing him. The night this happened, we went out to the bar, our usual Wednesday night spot, which was to play darts and steak and potato night for $5. My my friend testified at my trial about us closing the bar as we always did on Wednesday night, and then coming home, and Darren calling at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, because he wanted to be with her again. We ended up getting into a fight. Sheriff came and told us both to leave. I came back at 6 in the morning to get my stuff to go to work, and the gentleman was there in bed with her. So we got into a verbal altercation, and one thing led to another. And from what I can recollect is he grabbed a French knife out of the kitchen block, and he began threatening me with it. The pistol came out. I believe I had gotten the pistol out of her closet. So this gentleman threatened me with the knife and told me I needed to leave, and I drew down on him, and I told him, hey, you need to put the knife down. So we had pretty much a standoff at that point. Now, what happened next is it's kind of a blur to me. I was still hungover and still a little drunk, but from what I remember, he came at me. If you look at the testimony of the medical examiner, the first shot was from over 6 to 8 feet away. He was coming at me. The second shot was 3 feet or less. It's just a big blur after that. We're tumbling around and we're fighting over the pistol. It happened so fast. I remember us fighting and gun going off, and she got hit. She was shot through the cheek, and it stopped in her jaw. She got in the middle of us fighting and got shot in the mouth. And then I checked her, and I thought she was dead. I picked up the phone and called 911. It didn't go through. I ran, I left, I freaked out. After the crime happened, I went to a friend's house and got bandaged up, and I passed out from shock. I got up in the morning a few hours later, and it was on the TV. And my friend was watching it. She told me, hey, I think that's you on TV. I said, and I started watching it, and I seen her. I said, oh my God, she's alive. And I started crying. They had her coming out with the bandage on her face, sitting up on the stretcher before they put her in the ambulance. And I called my dad, and I told him, hey, he right away he told me the police have been here looking for you. They got you armed and dangerous. And I said, okay. He said, tell me where you're at, son. Go turn yourself in. So I did. They told her, she was going to be all right. This was routine surgery to them. You know, they waited 6 hours to take her in. It wasn't life-threatening. When they took her into pre-surgery, they repositioned her on her side, and they checked with the fiber optic scope to make sure everything was in the right place. Everybody left the operating room to go scrub for this surgery, and she lost air. They ran in there and did an emergency trachea, hit her with the paddles, and brought her back to life. But it was too late. She was already brain dead. She sat in a hospital room for 4 days with a DNR, do not resuscitate order. They took me down to court 7 days after this happened. And I was like, I don't have court. And they said, yeah, you do, come on. So I went down to court, and they told me, look, we're dropping the manslaughter and the aggravated assault charges. And I looked at the bailiff and asked him, what does this mean? And they said, we're introducing capital murder charges. And I looked at the bailiff, and he said, this means a death penalty now, boy. I'm like, death penalty? What are you talking about? They said, yeah, you're charged under double murder statute. I said, I didn't kill her, the hospital did. I had already talked to my family on the phone and heard that there was complications, that the hospital had suffocated her. You know, I was devastated. The family sued the hospital for wrongful death. I understand it was a very grueling time for them. Yeah, it was pretty sad. You know, I loved the lady, and I still think about her every day and why I'm here. And I wish that she would have lived to testify about this, because she would have told them what happened.
Doctors hate lawyers and they hate to testify, especially if they think they got a dog in the hunt. I mean, they got $1 jillion worth of insurance. It ain't going to cost them a dime. They can stand there and admit they killed her, and it wouldn't have cost them a penny. And nobody in the medical community would care. My name is IAmAKiller, and I was Charles Victor Thompson's original defense attorney. First trial, I thought, hinged entirely on the interpretation of the medical evidence. That Hayslip, the cause of her death was by her treatment at the hospital. The state's insistence that the standard was, what if the victim had had no medical care whatsoever, which I consider to be ludicrous, because there's almost no injury that can't cause death if left totally unattended. I think the standard ought to be whatever the situation is. She didn't die at the scene. She didn't bleed to death at the scene. They got her there. It was a nasty wound. I won't take anything away from that. But they had everything there to save her life and knew how to do it. It just didn't work out. In my opinion, with ordinary medical care, she would have survived.
You know, people make mistakes. People do stupid stuff. I think he just, a fit of rage and jealousy. And if I can't have her, nobody's gonna have her type thing. My name is Michael Donahue, and I'm Denise's brother. That picture of her leaning over, you know, sitting up on a gurney and leaning forward so she wouldn't choke to death on her own blood. And it was just horrific. That's etched in my mind forever. I talked to a doctor down there, and he said, you know, she's hurt bad, but it's, you know, we're going to take her back in a little bit and we're going to clean up the wound. And so I went to the rest of the family and told them everything's going to be okay. She's going to survive. She's probably going to have a speech impediment, and she's going to have a scarring on her face. About 8-10 hours later, it went from everything being okay to, you know, she's pretty much brain dead. And that hit me like a ton of bricks because, you know, I felt responsible for telling everybody it was okay. I don't know what happened, but, you know, something happened. And one thing I will say is the doctors cover doctors. They'll cover each other.
Doctors are not magicians. They're not all perfect. They're human beings. They've had more training, generally speaking, than the man or the woman in the street. But they're still human beings. I'm Paul Radelat. I'm a pathologist by profession. The thrust of the defense was that this was not a lethal wound, and she died because this unfortunate event took place in the hospital. It was my role to substantiate that idea as best I could within the bounds of integrity. The bullet penetrated what was essentially the upper airway and created bleeding right on top of the entrance to the windpipe. That was a primary concern of the physicians, and that's the way they acted. I don't think the doctors covered up. Maybe I'm being naive in that regard. I think they were trying to do their best. It's easy to make a mistake. And I don't know if they made one or not, but this is a very difficult situation. I'm not sure any blame, as I understand the word, should be apportioned to the medical personnel. They intended no evil. The shooter, I think we can safely say, intended evil.
Pretty sad. You know, I loved the lady, and I'll still think about her every day and why I'm here. And I wish that she would have lived to testify about this. because she would have told him what happened. She sat in a hospital room with nothing but an IV for fluids for 4 days with a DNR, do not resuscitate order. I said, I didn't kill her, the hospital did. I had already talked to my family on the phone and heard that they had suffocated her, that there was complications, that she had been in a coma.
Where do we begin with that one? Well, she's not in the hospital if you don't shoot her. I mean, it's an easy excuse to make. It's an easy one to blame. Blame the hospital. So I would in his situation as well. However, ultimately, though, the truth is that you held a gun to somebody's face and you pulled the trigger. And the reason why we know it was held close because there are powder burns on her cheek. My name is Wade Hayslip. Denise was my mom. My mom was a very kind-hearted individual. She taught me everything I needed to know about compassion. I would hope that Chuck comprehends. I hope that he understands the weight of the domino effect that he's started. The impact that this has caused. I feel it every day.
When I remembered Eric came at me, yeah, I shot once, twice, and then we fought, and the rest of it's just a blur to me.
It's just a blur. He shot once, twice. He fired 5 times, and when he was on the ground face down, it put a bullet into the back of his head. Okay. How's that a blur? That's pretty clear. It's pretty vivid. And intentional.
I believe I had gotten the pistol out of her closet. You know, I remember us fighting and gun going off, and she got hit. I don't remember exactly how it all happened.
He didn't go into detail about how the door got broken into, which the door frame was smashed. And also the encounter happened in the living room and in the kitchen. So I don't know how he would have gotten to the closet to do that. I feel like this is like a 5-year-old when you know you caught them doing something wrong, but they continually maintain that they didn't do it. Even though you literally just saw them do it. I feel like that is, the rest of the world knows that for whatever reason you're going to stick to this lie.
The night that the murder took place, we had all been here at Bimbo's, Denise, Chuck, and I, playing darts and doing steak night, normal night. My name is Missy Cook, and we're at Bimbo's in Houston, Texas. It's your local watering hole, basically an icon dive bar that's been here for decades. Denise was so freaking incredible. She was one of these people that you met, and the minute you met her and you started talking to her, 5 minutes into the conversation, you felt like you've known her forever. She was your sister, she was your aunt, she was your best friend, she was your childhood playmate. She just had this personability that you've just felt right at home. Denise and Chuck seemed like a very odd couple to me. One, because of his age. He was younger. I can't really say I remember the first time that I met him because, you know, in the bar business, you got 50 people in your face. If I had to speculate about me and my age and the time frame, I thought, damn, he's cute. But I think also the other side of that was I realized very quickly something's not right with that one. Keep an eye on him. I did have her come in to the bar one time with a black guy late at night and talk to me and was like, look, this is what he did. And, you know, the bar is dark. I didn't know. I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, look, I've got a lot of makeup on, but, you know, it's like, holy fucking shit, what are you doing? What are you doing with this guy? Get away from him. He's a loose cannon. He drinks too much. He's doing cocaine. Get away from this guy. And she's like, I know, I need to. I was uneasy because I knew Denise was trying to set boundaries with Chuck. Who knew this was going to happen?
We're right outside of the crime scene, actually. Denise lived in the subdivision behind us. My name is Jim Kelly. I owned a restaurant where Darren was working as a bartender for me that night. My understanding was that Denise was through with Chuck. Matter of fact, I know she was through with Chuck because she told me herself that she was done. She had dumped Chuck because I remember saying he was just a creep. And then she met Darren, and they were the exact opposite. If you could put this guy here and this guy here, you got an achiever and you got a loser. Darren was very outgoing, he was very friendly, he had a great smile, and and he was going places. They'd only been together just a few short weeks when all this happened. That night, Darren was working as my bartender, and he called me up and asked me, he said that Chuck had threatened Denise and wanted to go over to the place and see, protect her if he showed up. And I said, okay, go ahead, which, to this day, I regret that decision. Darren went over, and they had a physical confrontation. Darren whooped him, from what I understand, and then he said, Chuck, this is stupid because she's not going to date you. She's dating me. And will you drink a beer with me? And this is what he told me on the phone. Chuck agreed, and they talked things out. After the confrontation with Chuck, Darren called me, and he felt really good about what had happened. He felt like, Chuck and him had an agreement, and he felt like they had, that it was over, and that Chuck was going to go his way, and then Denise and Darren were going to go his way. And obviously that didn't happen. My understanding is that Chuck left, and he came back, knocked on the door, and Darren answered the door, and he just shot him in the chest. And then walked around and then shot him in the back of the head. And then proceeded to chase Denise around the apartment and caught her and blew the whole front of her face off. When I got here, Denise was still here. They were actually life flighting her out of here. Darren was just inside the door. I could see him laying on the ground, and the sheriff said, he's dead. He's gone. And I I just turned away. You know, in retrospect now, knowing what happened, what type of a person does it take to shake someone's hand, go away, and then come back hours later and just murder two people? What type of a person can do that?
This is where he's kicking in the door, right? Yeah, he splintered the door here. I remember this being shown during the original trial. My name is Harold Rogers, and I was a juror in the trial of Charles Thompson for the capital murder of two people. We didn't see a lot of these pictures of the damage done to Denise, and really I don't remember this being a large part of the deliberations of the jury. The jurors, I think, pretty well accepted the fact that if he had not shot her in the face like this, she would not have died, and so he was guilty of taking her life. Our primary issue was whether this guy was a continuing threat to society. And there were other things that came up in the course of the trial that convinced us that this guy was really a very dangerous person. One of the most striking things in the trial was the testimony of Diane Zernia.
It happened so fast. I remember us fighting and gun going off, and she got hit. She got in the middle of us fighting and got shot in the mouth. And then I checked her and I thought she was dead. I ran, I left, I freaked out.
These are not the facts that Diane Zernia presented at trial. The testimony was that in telling Diane how Denise Hayslip got shot, he said to Denise, "I can shoot you too, bitch," and put a pistol up to her jaw and pull the trigger. Diane was the most frightened person I've ever seen on a stand or anywhere else. I mean, she was a very thin lady to begin with, and she was just pale. Her eyes were as big as a silver dollar, and she was scared to death. She was frightened of this guy.
Okay, today's date is July 7th, 1998. The time is 5:45 p.m. I'm going to be walking across to make contact with a Charles Thompson, reference to a solicitation for capital murder. Hey, dude. Are you Thompson? Yeah. Okay. I've been waiting about 10 minutes. How long does it take to get y'all in here?
Sometimes it takes a while.
Okay. Well, a tip for I'm not too crazy about having to come to jail, you know? I don't think that's very cool.
Entrapment, I believe, is the technical term. An individual was sent undercover into his jail cell and was able to secure information from Chuck.
I was reading in the paper today, in order for a grand jury to give an indictment, they usually pull their witnesses in for testimony. There's a witness in this case and you take care of.
Okay. Well, when you say take care of, I thought this guy Max was gonna kill him.
He's fucking me around is what he's doing. I've already given this Max guy some money and he's fucked me over.
How much you give him so far?
125, like a down payment.
This is that girl he said you wanted to kill?
Yeah.
All right.
I just need to get rid of her. She's a faith witness. She's the only witness they got.
Okay. How hard would it be for me to find this chick to go ahead and knock her off?
Not hard. There's her address right here. You got a pen?
No. I can remember it. Okay, let's do this then.
So Thompson tells him, I need you to kill the witnesses, the people to whom I have confessed. You're sitting in a jury, and what do you hear? Drunken jerk comes into a house, kills one guy, shoots another one who subsequently dies, admits to it, and then tries to get the witnesses killed. Do you care about anything else?
Okay, what are we talking about? How much?
Name your price.
Well, if you got the address, okay, I'll kill her for $1,500. Oh, wait, I gotta memorize this now. Diane Zerna, Z-E-R-N-A. Diane Zerna. Diane Zerna. But where's this located at? Where's this at?
Neighborhood, it's off.
Okay, I know it.
Yeah. It's a Victorian-style house, and the mailbox is black and white spotted, painted like a cow. And she's about 48, 50 years old. She's a mother. She's got a 14-year-old daughter.
Okay. And then you get out now. It's $1,500.
No problem.
All right? Now, I'm gonna come after you if you don't pay me.
Oh, I'll pay you, man. I'll give you my word.
Okay, the bitch is dead. Go
All
back.
man's got in this world is his word.
Yeah, that's it. So stand on it, all right?
Yeah, no problem, buddy.
All right. Later. Come out here.
This was a real turning point for me. We thought a lot about the fact that if somebody had been successful in carrying out this murder for him, he would have had no remorse whatsoever that we could see. He would have been elated to get rid of her. This was the first time I started thinking about, wait a minute, maybe life in jail is not the right decision for this guy. That this was a guy capable of doing enormous evil.
I don't know how you ever murder somebody just in the moment. I don't care how angry. I don't know. Some people have that in them, though. My name is Kristen Mertens. I was the foreman on the jury for Charles Victor Thompson's retrial. We were not deciding guilt or innocence. We were deciding his punishment, whether or not to give him life or sentence him again to the death penalty. The defense did target pretty heavily that she had died 6 days later in the hospital. To me, that was irrelevant. He had shot her in the face, and he did murder somebody first. I think Darren was lost in the case. I don't think that his death was brought up as much as Denise's was. And I feel bad for his family. I wholeheartedly believe that he went there to kill Darren, and he went there to kill Denise. Darren was more of a hands-off, I just want to take him out of the picture. And I think he made it very personal when he killed Denise. I think for somebody like Chuck, he's narcissistic. He really enjoys the attention. I think if he were to have a life sentence, it would be a gift to him because of his personality and because of his makeup. I distinctly remember after the verdict was read and we were back in the deliberation room, the judge comes in and speaks with us, the prosecution does, etc. And I remember asking the question, is there any possible way, he's gonna be able to get out, my name's public, etc. There's always a concern. The judge says, oh, that's ridiculous. No, he's on death row now. And then 4 days later, I find out that he had escaped.
Search goes nationwide for escaped Texas inmates. Little snippet right here. I was at work and I got a call in the parking lot. I believe it was somebody from the district attorney's office who was informing me that Charles Thompson had escaped. Did I feel safe? Would I feel better with any type of police escort, that type of thing? And I said no. I didn't necessarily feel threatened. The many death row inmates, Charles Victor Thompson, who walked out the front door of the Harris County Jail and was free for 4 days before his recapture in Louisiana, will remain a manipulative, selfish, directionless person who shot and killed his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend. The one thing that stood out about this is that he goes to this great plot to escape and succeeds. And then he gets caught because he got drunk at a liquor store or a gas station or some type of convenience store in Louisiana. You're telling me that he hopped on a train, did all this stuff, managed to walk out of a jail, but he gets drunk and they catch him. At that moment, I go, what an idiot. But maybe that's not fair because I wouldn't know, I don't know what it's like to be on the run. And I don't know what it's like to be in jail for, at that point, 10 years. It doesn't surprise me at all that he was able to talk his way out of anything. He was charming and cunning and very manipulative. Chuck is quite the artist at manipulation.
There was a moment in 1984 when Christine Jessup was simply a 12-year-old girl who did not come home, and no one looking for her could have known that the answer would remain hidden for 36 years. On October 3rd, Christine left her home in Queensville, Ontario, after telling her family she was going to return a library book. She was young, she was alone, and then she disappeared. What followed became one of Canada's most haunting missing child investigations, a case that would consume investigators devastate a family, and eventually expose the devastating consequences of an innocent man being drawn into a murder investigation. For years, the name Christine Jessup was connected to an unanswered question. Where had she gone? Who had taken her? Who had killed her? And why had the truth remained hidden for so long? The answers would not come in the weeks after her disappearance. They would not come during the first year. They would not come during the first decade. The case would survive for more than 3 decades before modern forensic science finally began to reveal what investigators could not see in 1984. Christine's disappearance began on an ordinary October day. She lived with her family in Queensville, a community north of Toronto. At 12 years old, she was old enough to travel short distances on her own, and on that afternoon, she went to the library. She was expected to return home. Instead, she vanished. The moment a child fails to come home, time changes. Minutes become questions. Questions become fear. And when the expected return becomes impossible to explain, a missing person investigation begins. Christine's family quickly realized something was wrong. She had not simply stayed out longer than expected. She was gone. Police were contacted, searches began, and investigators started reconstructing her final known movements. The disappearance immediately carried the urgency that accompanies any missing child. But there was another problem. Investigators did not know whether Christine had left voluntarily, whether she had encountered someone she knew, or whether a stranger had approached her. There was no immediate explanation. There was only the empty space left by her absence. Search efforts expanded. People looked for Christine. Investigators examined possible sightings. Her disappearance became a public concern. The longer she remained missing, the darker the possibilities became. Then, 2 months later, the case changed forever. Christine's body was discovered in a wooded area near Queensville. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing child case into a homicide investigation. The question was no longer where Christine was. She was dead. Now detectives had to determine who had killed her. The forensic examination became central. Investigators collected evidence from Christine's body and the surrounding scene. Among that evidence was biological material that would eventually become one of the most important pieces of the entire investigation. But in 1984, the forensic technology available to investigators was far more limited than it would become decades later. DNA profiling, as investigators understand it today, was still in its infancy. There was no modern national DNA database capable of rapidly comparing an unknown profile with thousands of known offenders. There was no genetic genealogy capable of searching distant family relationships. Investigators had to rely on the techniques available to them. They examined the physical evidence. They interviewed people. They searched for witnesses. They developed theories. And eventually, suspicion focused on a man who lived near the Jessup family. His name was Guy Paul. Morin became the central suspect in the case, and the investigation that followed would become one of the most controversial wrongful conviction cases in Canadian history. The police theory surrounding Morin developed through circumstances that, viewed decades later, demonstrated how dangerous investigative assumptions can become when physical evidence does not provide a definitive answer. Morin denied involvement, but suspicion grew. Investigators examined his movements, his relationship to the area, and information surrounding Christine's disappearance. The case attracted intense attention. Christine was a child. Her murder had shocked the community. The public wanted an answer. Investigators wanted a suspect. And the pressure to solve the crime was immense. Morin was eventually charged with Christine's murder. The case moved toward trial, but the evidence was not as straightforward as investigators initially believed. The prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitness who could place Morin killing Christine. There was no definitive forensic identification connecting him to the murder. Yet the case proceeded. Morin was tried and acquitted in 1986. The acquittal did not end the controversy. Prosecutors appealed, and a second trial followed. In 1992, Morin was convicted of Christine's murder and sentenced to life in prison. The case had now reached a horrifying contradiction. A man had been convicted, but the physical evidence had never provided the certainty expected in a murder prosecution. Morin continued to maintain his innocence. His legal battle continued. The case became increasingly controversial as questions emerged about the investigation and the reliability of the evidence used against him. Then, forensic science began changing the story. Biological evidence connected to Christine's murder was eventually examined using DNA technology. The testing produced a profile that did not match Morin. The implications were enormous. If the biological material recovered from Christine came from the murderer, then the person responsible could not be Morin. The evidence that had once been unable to answer the central question was now challenging the conviction itself. In 1995, Morin was acquitted for a second time, and the conviction was overturned. He had spent years fighting to prove that he had not killed Christine. The DNA evidence finally gave him what the original investigation could not: a scientific exclusion. But even after Morin was exonerated, another question remained. If Morin had not killed Christine, then who had? The DNA profile belonged to an unknown man. The case had returned to its most painful position. Christine was still dead. Her killer was still free, and the biological evidence that had cleared an innocent man had not yet identified the real offender. For years, the unknown DNA profile remained just that, unknown. Investigators could compare it against available databases, but no match emerged. The case remained cold. Christina's family had already endured an unimaginable loss. Now they had to endure another kind of uncertainty: the knowledge that the person who killed their daughter had never been identified. The passage of time made the problem more difficult. Witness memories faded. Investigators changed. Communities changed. People moved away. The original crime scene changed. But the biological evidence remained. That evidence became a silent witness waiting for technology to catch up with it. Decades after Christine's death, forensic science had reached a point where investigators could revisit old cases in ways that would have been impossible in 1984. DNA databases had expanded. Laboratory techniques had improved. Investigators had access to new methods for examining biological evidence. And eventually, the unknown profile connected to Christine's murder began to point toward a real person. The breakthrough came in 2020. Investigators announced that the DNA profile associated with Christina's murder had been linked to a man named Calvin Hoover. Hoover had died in 2015, meaning he would never stand trial for Christine's murder. But his identification changed the case in a way that decades of investigation had failed to accomplish. The killer finally had a name. The mystery that had survived 36 years had been cracked. Yet the revelation carried a bitter complexity. Christine's killer was dead. There would be no courtroom confession, no trial, no cross-examination, no sentence. The legal system could not punish him. But the scientific evidence could finally tell Christine's family who had been responsible. The discovery also transformed the meaning of the evidence that had once cleared Guy Paul Morin. The same biological trail that had helped overturn a wrongful conviction eventually identified the actual perpetrator. It was a devastating reminder of how much had gone wrong in the original investigation, but also a demonstration of how powerful properly interpreted forensic evidence could become. Christine had disappeared in 1984. Her body had been found later that year. Morin had been accused, tried, acquitted, convicted, imprisoned, and ultimately exonerated. Through all of it, the killer remained hidden. The biological evidence remained. And 36 years after Christine vanished, the truth finally emerged from that evidence. The case was no longer simply a story about a missing girl. It had become a story about a wrongful conviction, a failed investigation, the evolution of forensic science, and a killer who believed time had erased his connection to the crime. But time had not erased the evidence. It had only delayed the moment when investigators would understand what the evidence was capable of revealing. And somewhere inside that old forensic record was the answer that Christine's family had been waiting for since the day their 12-year-old daughter failed to come home. The disappearance of Christine Jessup did not begin with a dramatic warning, a known enemy, or an obvious sign that danger was approaching. That was part of what made the case so disturbing. Christine was 12 years old, living with her family in Queensville, Ontario, and on October 3rd, still 1984, she left home to return a library book. It was an ordinary task. Nothing about it suggested that she would never return. But she disappeared, and within hours, the ordinary world around her family began to collapse into uncertainty. Police were called. Questions multiplied. Where had Christine gone? Had she changed her plans? Had someone approached her? Had she accepted a ride? Had she been taken against her will? Investigators had to consider every possibility because there was no immediate explanation for why a 12-year-old girl had vanished. The search became urgent because every missing hour could matter. Christina's family and investigators needed to know where she had gone and who had last seen her. The investigation expanded through the community around Queensville. Officers gathered information and attempted to reconstruct Christine's movements, but the case quickly developed a painful feature that would remain throughout the decades that followed. There were clues, but no definitive answer. The investigation could identify possibilities without proving them. That difference would eventually become critical. Christine was missing for approximately 2 months before her body was discovered in a wooded area near Queensville. The discovery ended the uncertainty about whether she might still be alive, but it introduced an even darker question. Someone had killed her. The investigation was now a homicide case, and detectives needed to identify that person. The physical evidence collected from Christine became extremely important. Biological material was recovered and preserved. At the time, however, investigators did not have the modern DNA tools that would eventually transform the case. The forensic science available in 1984 could not produce the kind of genetic identification that investigators now take for granted. That limitation meant detectives had to build their case through other forms of evidence. They interviewed people. They examined relationships. They considered behavior. They investigated individuals who might have had access to Christine. One man eventually became the focus of their attention. Guy Paul Moran lived in the same general area and was known to the Jessup family. The investigation began to center on him, and the pressure surrounding the case increased. Christine was a child. Her murder had shocked the community. The public wanted the police to identify the killer. The family wanted answers. Investigators needed a theory that explained what had happened. Moran became that theory, but a theory is not proof. Moran maintained that he had nothing to do with Christine's disappearance or death. The case nevertheless moved forward. He was arrested and charged with murder. The prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitness who had seen Moran kill Christine. There was no DNA evidence placing him at the crime. The forensic evidence that would eventually prove so important had not yet been developed into a usable identification, yet the case proceeded to trial. In 1986, Moran was acquitted. For the moment, the legal system had rejected the prosecution's case, but the acquittal did not end the investigation or the public controversy. Prosecutors appealed. A second trial followed. The same basic mystery remained at the center of everything. Christine Jessup was dead, and investigators still needed to determine who had killed her. Moran once again became the accused man. The pressure of the case was enormous. The prosecution presented its evidence. The defense challenged it. And in 1992, Moran was convicted of Christine's murder and sentenced to life in prison. It was a devastating development. A man who had consistently denied killing Christine was now legally classified as her murderer. Yet something remained unresolved. The physical evidence had never truly established that Moran was the killer. The conviction depended heavily on circumstantial evidence and investigative conclusions that would later be seriously questioned. Moran continued fighting to clear his name. The case did not disappear. Instead, the evidence began to move in a direction that investigators had not anticipated. DNA technology was advancing rapidly. Biological samples that had once been of limited forensic value could now be analyzed at a level unimaginable when Christine was murdered. Investigators and legal experts returned to the evidence from the case. The question was simple but potentially devastating. Could the biological material recovered from Christine identify the person responsible? The answer would eventually change everything. DNA testing demonstrated that the biological evidence did not match Guy Paul Moran. That result was not a minor technical discrepancy. It struck directly at the foundation of his conviction. If the biological material belonged to the person responsible for Christine's murder, then Morin could not be that person. The evidence provided a scientific exclusion where years of argument had failed to provide certainty. In 1995, Morin was acquitted and exonerated. The man who had spent years under suspicion was finally cleared. But the exoneration created another problem that was just as devastating. Clearing an innocent man did not identify the guilty one. Investigators now knew that the killer was a different man, but they did not know who that man was. The DNA profile became an unknown. It could be compared against available databases, but no match immediately emerged. The case had been transformed, but it had not been solved. For Christine's family, the exoneration of Morin brought a complicated mixture of relief and renewed grief. An innocent man had been wrongly accused, but the person who had actually killed Christine remained free. The family still had no name. They still had no complete explanation. And the passage of time continued. The investigation became one of the most prominent examples of the danger of wrongful conviction. Morin's case demonstrated how a murder investigation can become distorted when investigators become committed to one suspect before the evidence truly establishes that person's guilt. Once a theory takes hold, every new fact can be interpreted through it. Evidence that does not fit may be minimized. Ambiguous circumstances may appear more significant than they really are. A suspect can gradually become the center of a case not because the physical evidence proves guilt, but because investigators begin to interpret everything around that suspect. Christine's murder showed the consequences of that process. The eventual DNA testing broke the cycle. Science did not identify the killer immediately, but it proved that the person who had been convicted was not the person whose biological evidence had been recovered. That was a crucial distinction. It meant the investigation had to start thinking about the real offender rather than defending an old theory. For years, the unknown DNA profile remained in the background. It was a genetic signature without a name. Investigators could search, but technology and databases had limitations. The profile did not match the available record. The case therefore entered another long period of uncertainty. Christine's family continued without the answer they wanted. The murder remained officially unsolved. Meanwhile, forensic science continued to evolve. DNA databases expanded. Laboratories became more sophisticated. Investigators learned more about how biological evidence could be interpreted. The concept of using genetic relationships to identify unknown individuals became increasingly important. Cold cases that once appeared impossible were being reopened because evidence that had been collected decades earlier could suddenly be used in new ways. Christine's case was one of those investigations waiting for a technological breakthrough. The evidence had already been collected. It did not need to be discovered again. It needed to be understood differently. That distinction became the foundation of the eventual solution. By the 2010 investigators had tools that could reach much further into unidentified DNA profile. The unknown man connected to Christine's murder could potentially be identified through genetic relationships even if his own DNA had never appeared in a traditional criminal database. Investigators began exploring those possibilities. The search moved beyond the original suspects. It moved beyond the theories of the 1980s and 1990s. The investigation was now being guided by biology. The question was no longer simply who had a motive or who lived nearby. It was becoming whose genetic family does this unknown profile belong to? That was a completely different kind of investigation, and it eventually led to a name investigators had not been able to reach for decades: Calvin Hoover. Hoover had died in 2015 by the time investigators identified him as the person connected to Christine's murder. He could not be arrested or questioned. There would be no trial. But the identification carried enormous significance. The unknown DNA profile finally had an identity. The man who had been invisible to investigators for 36 years was no longer invisible. The evidence that had once cleared Morin had finally pointed toward the real killer. Yet that revelation also raised a painful question about how much time had been lost. Christine had been 12 when she was killed. Morin had spent years fighting a wrongful conviction. The actual killer had lived for decades without being identified, and the family had waited through all of it. The case therefore became more than a story about forensic success. It became a story about the cost of investigative failure and the extraordinary persistence of biological evidence. The DNA did not speak in 1984. It did not speak loudly enough in 1992, but it remained. It survived the wrongful conviction. It survived Moran's exoneration. It survived decades of unanswered questions. And eventually, when forensic science had advanced enough, it provided the missing identity. The killer had a name. The mystery had a direction. But for Christine's family, the most important question remained the simplest one. After 36 years of uncertainty, would knowing the killeress' identity finally bring any measure of peace? The name Calvin Hoover did not emerge from the original investigation. It did not come from the first wave of witnesses, the early searches, or the theories that had dominated the case in the 1980s. It emerged decades later from evidence that had been collected when Christine Jessup was still 12 years old. That distinction mattered. For years, the investigation had been built around human memory and circumstantial evidence. Eventually, it would be rebuilt around biological evidence. The difference between those two approaches would change the case completely. When Christine disappeared in October 1984, investigators were working in a very different forensic world. DNA profiling had not yet become the powerful investigative tool it would later become. Police could collect biological evidence, but they did not possess the modern databases and analytical methods that could turn an unknown biological sample into a name. As a result, investigators had to look elsewhere for answers. They looked at the people around Christine. They examined her movements. They considered who might have had an opportunity to encounter her. And eventually, suspicion focused on Guy Paul Morin. Morin lived in the same community and was known to the Jessup family. That connection placed him within the investigation. As investigators tried to reconstruct Christine's final hours, Morin became increasingly important to the case. But the evidence against him was largely circumstantial. There was no eyewitness who could establish that Morin had killed Christine. There was no DNA identification connecting him to the biological evidence. Yet the case proceeded through the courts. In 1986, Morin was acquitted. The verdict should have represented the end of the prosecution against him, but it did not end the investigation. Instead, prosecutors appealed, and Morin was tried again. In 1992, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. A man who had consistently denied involvement in Christine's death was now legally responsible for it. But the case contained a problem that could not remain hidden forever. The biological evidence still existed. As DNA technology improved, investigators were able to examine that evidence in ways that had been impossible when the murder occurred. The results were devastating to the original theory. The DNA did not match Morin. The evidence pointed to another man. Morin was not the source of the biological material. The scientific result eventually contributed to his exoneration in 1995. The reversal exposed one of the most troubling realities in the case. The wrong man had spent years under the shadow of a murder he did not commit. But the scientific evidence had also created an opportunity. If the DNA did not belong to Morin, then it belonged to someone else. That unknown person was potentially the actual killer. Investigators now had a biological profile that could be used to search for the truth. The problem was that the profile did not immediately identify anyone. Traditional DNA databases could only produce a result if the offender or a close enough match was already represented. No such match appeared. The killer remained unidentified. Christine's murder therefore entered another long period of uncertainty. The case had been transformed by DNA, but it had not been solved by DNA. It had simply become a different kind of cold case. Instead of asking whether Morin was guilty, investigators now had to ask who the unknown male contributor was. The answer could be anywhere. The person could have changed his name, moved away, left the country, or died. There was no guarantee that the DNA would ever produce a match. Years passed. The unknown profile remained. Christina's family continued to live with the fact that their daughter's killer had never been identified. Meanwhile, Guy Paul Morin attempted to rebuild his life after the ordeal of wrongful conviction. His exoneration became a landmark moment in Canadian criminal justice and a powerful example of how unreliable investigative assumptions can destroy an innocent person's life. The case demonstrated the importance of independent forensic evidence and the danger of allowing circumstantial theories to overpower objective testing. But even after Morin was cleared, the Jessup family still had to live with another painful truth. The real killer remained free. The investigation could not stop there. As the years passed, investigators continued to preserve the evidence. That preservation would become crucial because forensic science was evolving at extraordinary speed. DNA analysis became more precise. Databases became larger. Investigators learned how to extract more information from old biological material. And then a new approach began changing cold case investigations around the world. Genetic genealogy. Traditional forensic DNA searching attempts to find a direct or close match between an unknown profile and profiles already held by law enforcement. Genetic genealogy works differently. It can use genetic relationships to locate biological relatives of an unknown person. Investigators can then build family trees, identify possible branches, and narrow the search until a living or deceased individual becomes a viable suspect. The method had already helped solve other high-profile cold cases. Now investigators could consider whether it might work for Christine. The biological evidence was decades old, but it had one enormous advantage. It had survived. The killer might have forgotten what he left behind. He might have believed the case was permanently buried. He might have believed the passage of time had protected him. But biological evidence does not forget. The genetic information remains. Once investigators began examining the profile through newer methods, the search could move beyond traditional criminal databases. Instead of asking whether the killer had been previously arrested, investigators could ask whether the killer had relatives whose genetic information might reveal his identity. That shift was profound. A person who had never appeared in a police database could potentially be found through members of his family. The investigation therefore moved into a territory that would have been unimaginable during the original search. Detectives could follow biological relationships backward and sideways through generations. They could examine family connections that had never been part of the original police file. Eventually, those methods led investigators toward Calvin Hoover. Hoover was not a name that had dominated the Christine Jessup investigation. He had not been the central suspect in the 1980s. He had not been convicted. He had not been publicly identified as the killer during the decades when Morin was being investigated. Instead, he emerged through the forensic trail. Investigators then needed to confirm whether Hoover was truly the source of the DNA. The identification could not rest solely on genealogy. Genetic genealogy can generate a lead, but investigators still need a direct forensic comparison before making a definitive identification. That comparison was ultimately obtained. The DNA associated with Christine's murder was connected to Hoover. The unknown man finally had a name. But there was a complication that made the breakthrough both powerful and painful. Hoover had died in 2015. He could not be arrested. He could not be questioned. He could not appear in court. There would be no trial where prosecutors could present the evidence and ask a jury to determine guilt. There would be no opportunity for a defense attorney to cross-examine witnesses or challenge the evidence on his behalf. The investigation could identify him, but the justice system could not prosecute a dead man. That meant the conclusion would be fundamentally different from the conclusion in a normal homicide case. The family would receive an answer, but not a courtroom verdict. For 36 years, the question had been, who killed Christine? Now investigators could finally answer it. The revelation also changed the meaning of the entire history of the case. The original investigation had centered on Morin. His life had been devastated by an accusation that turned out to be wrong. He had spent years fighting to clear his name. The DNA evidence eventually did that. The same DNA evidence then continued its journey toward the real offender. In that sense, the biological evidence became a silent witness that had remained consistent while human interpretations changed around it. Investigators had been wrong about Morin. The DNA had not. It had always pointed toward someone else. The tragedy was that it took decades for investigators to follow it. Christine's murder therefore became a case study in the difference between suspicion and evidence. Suspicion can be immediate. Evidence can take years to understand. Investigators in 1984 had to make decisions with the information available to them, but later investigators had the responsibility to question those decisions when new evidence emerged. The DNA forced them to do exactly that. It overturned the old theory. It exposed the wrongful conviction, and eventually it identified the real killer. By 2020, the investigation had reached a point that once seemed impossible. Christine's family finally knew the identity of the man responsible for her death. The case had remained unresolved for 36 years, but the evidence had never stopped existing. It had waded through decades of technological change. It had survived legal battles, public controversy, and the passage of time. The name Calvin Hoover finally gave the family something they had been denied since 1984, certainty. But certainty was not the same as closure. Closure is a human word for a human wound. It cannot be measured by a laboratory result. It cannot be guaranteed by identifying a suspect. Christine was still gone. Moran could never recover the years lost to the wrongful conviction. The Jessup family could never recover the daughter they lost. And Hoover could never stand before a judge and answer for what he had done. The case was solved, but it was solved in a way that left almost as many questions about justice as it answered about identity. The DNA breakthrough had ended the mystery of who was responsible. It had not erased the consequences of everything that came before. It had simply revealed, after 36 years, what the evidence had been trying to say all along. The man convicted was innocent, and the real killer had been hidden in the DNA. The revelation that Calvin Hoover was connected to Christine Jessup's murder changed the case, but it did not erase the years of uncertainty that had come before it. To understand why the breakthrough mattered so much, investigators and the public had to look backward into the investigation that had once placed another man at the center of the crime. The story of Christine's murder was never only about finding a killer. It was also about understanding how an investigation can go wrong when suspicion hardens into certainty before science has finished speaking. Christine was 12 years old when she disappeared in October 1984. Her family had expected her to return home after going out to return a library book. Instead, she vanished. The community searched. Police investigated. The family waited. 4 weeks, there was no definitive explanation. Then Christine's body was found in a wooded area near Queensville. The search for a missing child became a murder investigation, and the pressure to solve it intensified immediately. Detectives needed answers, and one of the people who came under suspicion was Guy Paul Moran. Moran lived nearby and was known to the Jessup family. That connection placed him inside the investigative circle. Once investigators began focusing on him, the case increasingly revolved around whether he could be responsible. The prosecution would eventually rely on circumstantial evidence to argue that he was the killer. But circumstantial evidence can be dangerous when it is interpreted without sufficient physical confirmation. A person may appear suspicious without being guilty. A coincidence can look like a pattern. An uncertain recollection can become more convincing as it is repeated. And once investigators begin constructing a theory around a suspect, every new piece of information risks being interpreted through that theory. Christine's case became an extraordinary example of those dangers. Moran was tried in 1986 and acquitted. The acquittal should have forced investigators and prosecutors to reconsider the case from the ground up. Instead, the legal battle continued. A second trial followed, and in 1992, Moran was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. For the Jessup family, the conviction appeared to provide an answer. For Moran, it meant the loss of his freedom and the continuation of a fight he insisted he should never have had to fight. The case remained controversial because the conviction did not rest on the kind of forensic evidence that could conclusively establish Moran as the killer. The biological evidence would eventually expose the problem. As DNA technology advanced, investigators were able to test biological material associated with Christine's murder. The result was decisive. The DNA did not match Moran. That single scientific finding changed the direction of the entire case. Moran was not the source of the biological evidence. If the biological material belonged to the murderer, then the person responsible was still unknown. In 1995, Moran was acquitted and exonerated. The man who had once been convicted of killing Christine was finally cleared, but the victory came at an enormous cost. Morin had spent years under the shadow of a murder he did not commit. His name had become associated with the case. His life had been transformed by the accusation, and the real killer remained unidentified. The DNA profile became the most important, unresolved clue in the investigation. It was objective. It did not depend on memory. It did not change because public opinion changed. It did not care which theory investigators preferred. It simply represented biological evidence from the crime. But for years, that evidence could not produce a name. Investigators searched available databases. No match emerged. The killer remained a genetic unknown. The case, therefore, entered another period of silence. Christine's family had already endured years of uncertainty, and now they knew that the man once convicted was innocent, while the actual killer remained free or potentially dead. The passage of time made the situation more complicated. People who had known Christine grew older. Investigators retired. Memories became less reliable. Records became historical documents. The community moved forward, but the murder remained unresolved. Yet the biological evidence did not age in the same way. That was the extraordinary advantage of DNA. It could remain useful even after witnesses had forgotten details and investigators had changed. The evidence could be tested again when new technology became available. The eventual breakthrough would depend on that fact. By the 2010 forensic investigators were increasingly using genetic genealogy to solve cases that had resisted conventional DNA database searches. Instead of waiting for a direct match, investigators could look for genetic relatives. An unknown profile could become a family connection. A family connection could become a genealogical tree, and that tree could eventually lead to a specific person. The method required careful investigative work and confirmation through direct DNA comparison, but it offered something traditional searches could not: a way to identify people who had never been in a criminal database. That possibility became critical in Christine's case. The unknown DNA profile was not simply a piece of forensic information anymore. It was a doorway. Investigators began examining the genetic relationships associated with the profile. The search eventually led to Calvin Hoover. Hoover had not been the public face of the investigation decades earlier. His name had not carried the weight that Morin's name had carried. He had not spent years defending himself against a murder charge. Instead, he emerged from the biological evidence itself. That distinction made the breakthrough so powerful. The suspect was not being selected because of a theory constructed in the 1980s. He was being identified through evidence that had been recovered from the crime and preserved for decades. Investigators then sought confirmation. The genealogical lead had to be tested against direct DNA evidence. When the comparison connected Hoover to the biological profile associated with Christine's murder, the investigation reached the answer it had been searching for since 1984. But the answer came with a painful complication. Hoover had died in 2015. He could not be arrested. He could not be prosecuted. He could not face a jury. He could not be sentenced. The identification could establish who the evidence pointed to, but the criminal justice system could not provide the traditional ending of a homicide case. There would be no dramatic courtroom confrontation, no final cross-examination, no moment when a judge could pronounce a sentence against the man responsible. Instead, the conclusion came through forensic science and official investigation. The case had been solved, but not in the way anyone would have imagined when Christine disappeared. The breakthrough also forced the public to confront the long shadow of the wrongful conviction. Guy Paul Morin had been imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. The real killer had remained unidentified while an innocent man fought to clear his name. That sequence was one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The same evidence that ultimately identified Hoover also demonstrated why Morin should never have been convicted. It was a powerful reminder that forensic evidence is most valuable when investigators allow it to challenge their assumptions rather than simply support them. The story of Christine Jessup, therefore, became a warning for future investigation. The strongest case is not always the case that produces the fastest conviction. The strongest case is the one that survives scrutiny when every piece of evidence is examined independently. Christine's murder demonstrated what can happen when a theory becomes stronger than the facts supporting it. It also demonstrated how new technology can correct mistakes that once seemed irreversible. The DNA did not simply solve an old murder. It helped repair part of a justice system failure. For Christine's family, however, the breakthrough was not simply a forensic victory. It was the end of a question that had lasted 36 years. They finally knew the name of the man connected to their daughter's death. That knowledge could never replace Christine. She had been 12 years old when her life was taken. She never grew into adulthood. She never experienced the decades that followed. Her family lived those decades without her, carrying memories of a child who would forever remain 12 in their mind. Hoover's death meant that the family would never hear a confession directly from him. They would never know every detail of what happened. Some questions would remain unanswered, but the central mystery had been resolved. The biological evidence had spoken. The man whose DNA was associated with the murder had been identified, and the innocent man who had once been convicted had been cleared. Those two facts became inseparable from Christine's story. The investigation had taken an extraordinary path from disappearance to murder, from accusation to conviction, from exoneration to a decades-long cold case, and finally to a forensic identification. Each stage revealed something different about the limits and possibilities of criminal investigation. In 1984, investigators had a murdered child and a desperate need for answers. In 1992, the justice system had a convicted man. In 1995, science overturned that conviction. And in 2020, science finally provided the name that had been missing. The timeline was painful, but it was also revealing. It showed that the truth had not vanished. It had remained embedded in the evidence, waiting for investigators to develop the ability to recognize it. Christine's murder had been silent for decades, but silence did not mean the case was empty. Beneath the silence was a genetic trail. Beneath the old theories was biological evidence, and beneath the years of uncertainty was a truth that had survived everything the passage of time could throw at it. The question was no longer whether Christine's killer would ever be identified. He had been. The question became what his identification meant for everyone whose lives had been changed by the case. For the Jessup family, it meant knowing. For Guy Paul Morin, it was another confirmation that the evidence had ultimately vindicated him. For investigators, it became a lesson that could never be ignored. And for the public, it became a reminder that a cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the answer is already there. Sometimes it is simply waiting for the science to catch up. For more than 3 decades, the DNA connected to Christine Jessup's murder remained a silent witness. It could not speak in 1984. It could not identify the killer when the first investigation was underway. It could not stop an innocent man from becoming the focus of suspicion. But it remained inside the evidence, waiting for forensic science to become sophisticated enough to reveal what it already knew. That waiting period became one of the most important elements of the entire case. Christine's murder had generated evidence, but evidence alone is not enough. Investigators need technology capable of interpreting it. In 1984, that technology was still developing. By the time the case was finally solved, the forensic landscape had changed almost beyond recognition. The evolution of DNA science would become the bridge between the crime and the eventual identification of Calvin Hoover. When Christine disappeared, investigators had no modern DNA database to search. There was no system that could instantly compare an unknown biological sample against millions of profiles. There was no genetic genealogy process capable of identifying a suspect through distant relatives. Investigators worked with what they had. They collected evidence, documented the scene, questioned witnesses, and built theories from the available information. That was how Guy Paul Morin became a suspect. The investigation was driven largely by circumstances surrounding the community and the people connected to Christine. But when physical evidence was eventually subjected to modern DNA testing, the theory collapsed. The biological material did not match Morin. The science had contradicted the investigation. That moment was critical because it demonstrated the power of objective evidence. Human beings can make mistakes. Investigators can make mistakes. Witnesses can make mistakes. Memories can change. But DNA evidence, when properly collected and interpreted, can provide a far more stable foundation. The problem was that DNA could clear Morin without immediately identifying the real killer. The unknown profile remained. That was the beginning of another long chapter in the investigation. The profile was searched against available records, but there was no match. The person responsible for Christine's murder remained outside the reach of traditional forensic databases. This was one of the central frustrations of cold case investigation. Investigators can possess a powerful piece of evidence and still have no way to connect it to a person. The biological profile existed, but the identity behind it did not. Years passed, the case remained open in the historical sense, but there was no obvious path forward. Then forensic genealogy began transforming the way investigators approached unidentified DNA. The concept was revolutionary because it changed the question. Instead of asking whether the offender's DNA was already stored in a law enforcement database, investigators could ask whether the offender had biological relatives whose DNA could provide a connection. A genetic relationship could reveal a family could reveal a branch could reveal a possible individual. That individual could then be tested directly against the crime scene evidence. It was not magic. It was investigative work supported by genetics, and it opened doors that traditional DNA searching could not. In Christine's case, the unknown DNA profile became the foundation of this new approach. Investigators were no longer trapped by the limitations of the original databases. They could explore relationships that had not existed in the police system. This mattered because the actual killer had apparently never provided investigators with a direct DNA match during the earlier decade. If his genetic relatives were present in relevant databases, however, investigators might be able to work backward toward him. The investigation became a genealogical puzzle built around biological facts. Each connection could narrow the field. Each branch of a family tree could eliminate possibility. The process required patience, accuracy, and careful confirmation because investigators could not simply accuse a person based on a distant genetic relationship. A genealogical lead was only the beginning. The final identification had to be established through direct DNA comparison. Eventually, the trail led investigators toward Calvin Hoover. Hoover had lived in the Toronto area and had connections that made the genetic evidence relevant to the investigation. But the crucial question remained. Was he actually the man whose biological material had been recovered in connection with Christine's murder? Investigators obtained a reference sample and compared it with the forensic profile. The comparison provided the answer. Hoover was the source of the DNA associated with the crime. After 36 years, the unknown offender had a name. The case that had once seemed impossible to solve had finally produced an identity. But the identification came with an extraordinary complication. Calvin Hoover was already dead. He had died in 2015, 5 years before investigators publicly announced the breakthrough. That meant the case could never follow the conventional path from identification to arrest to trial. The person responsible could not be questioned. He could not be confronted with the evidence. He could not be prosecuted. The justice system could not impose a criminal sentence on him. For Christine's family, this created a strange kind of ending. They had the answer they had wanted for decades, but they could never hear the answer from the man himself. They could never ask why. They could never hear a confession. They could never force him to explain what had happened to Christine. Yet the scientific identification still carried immense importance. It transformed the case from an unresolved murder into a solved homicide. The name of the killer was no longer unknown. The biological evidence had established the connection, and perhaps most importantly, the identification confirmed what had been suspected after Morin's exoneration. The man convicted in Christine's murder had not been the real killer. That fact is central to understanding the case. Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction was not a side story. It was one of the defining elements of the investigation. The case demonstrated how devastating a wrongful conviction can become when investigators and prosecutors are convinced they have the right suspect. Morin lost years of his life. His reputation was damaged. His family endured the consequences. Even after he was acquitted in 1986, the legal process continued, eventually leading to his conviction in 1992. Only the advancement of DNA testing finally provided the scientific evidence that cleared him. The tragedy was that the same investigation that eventually exonerated Morin had once relied heavily on circumstantial reasoning to convict him. The lesson was unmistakable. An investigation must remain open to being wrong. If investigators decide too early that they know who the killer is, they may stop searching for the person who actually committed the crime. Christine's case demonstrated that danger with extraordinary clarity. The real killer remained unidentified while an innocent man was prosecuted. The biological evidence was present, but its significance was not fully understood. Once DNA testing proved Moran was not the source of the biological material, investigators were forced to reconsider the entire case. That reconsideration eventually opened the door to genetic genealogy decades later. The case therefore became an example of how old evidence can become more valuable as science improves. The evidence did not change. The technology did. The biological material recovered decades earlier remained connected to the same crime. What changed was the ability of investigators to interpret it. That is why cold cases can remain alive even when they appear forgotten. The passage of time may reduce the availability of witnesses and memories, but it can also create new opportunities. Databases grow. Algorithms improve. Laboratory methods become more sensitive. Investigators learn from previous cases. Techniques once considered experimental become standard investigative tools. A piece of evidence that was inconclusive in one decade may become decisive in another. Christine's murder became a powerful demonstration of that principle. The case also highlighted the emotional complexity of forensic breakthrough. From the outside, the identification of Hoover might appear to be a triumphant ending. A cold case solved after 36 years. A murderer identified through DNA, a mystery finally cracked. But for Christine's family, the breakthrough was inseparable from the reality of what had been lost. Their daughter was still gone. She had been 12 years old in 1984. She never had the opportunity to become an adult. She never experienced the decades in which the investigation continued. The family had to grow older without her while the unknown killer remained somewhere beyond their reach. When investigators finally identified Hoover, the family gained knowledge, but not time. They could not recover the years Christine should have lived. They could not undo the suffering caused by the murder. They could only know, at last, who the evidence identified as responsible. That knowledge mattered. It gave the family an answer that had been denied to them for 36 years. It also restored a crucial truth to the historical record. Guy Paul Morin was innocent of Christine's murder. The actual offender was someone else. The scientific evidence had eventually separated those two truths. The same case that had once produced a wrongful conviction now stood as a warning against relying too heavily on circumstantial assumptions. The DNA had become the most reliable voice in the investigation. It had no memory to distort. It had no personal interest. It had no fear. It simply connected biological material to a person. That connection arrived decades after the crime, but its importance was immediate. The investigation had finally reached the point where the unknown profile could be interpreted. The mystery had been reduced to a name, and that name had been waiting in the evidence all along. Christine Jessup's murder had once appeared to be a case where the truth had disappeared with the passage of time. Instead, the truth had remained hidden in a form that investigators could not yet fully understand. 36 years later, forensic genealogy provided the missing bridge. The killer had been identified. The wrongful conviction had been exposed. The family finally had an answer. But the story was still not finished because identifying the killer forced investigators and the public to confront the larger question that had haunted the case from the beginning. How had an innocent man been convicted while the real killer remained invisible for so long? The answer to that question lies in one of the most troubling chapters of the Christine Jessup investigation, because finding the real killer did more than solve a 36-year-old murder. It exposed how easily an investigation can become trapped inside its own assumption. When Christine disappeared in 1984, investigators faced enormous pressure. A 12-year-old girl was missing. Her family wanted answers. The community wanted reassurance. Police needed to find out what had happened before the trail disappeared. When Christine's body was discovered, the pressure intensified. The investigation now had a clear victim, but no clear offender. Every hour mattered. Every witness mattered. Every unexplained detail mattered. In that environment, investigators began looking closely at the people who lived near the Jessup family, and Guy Paul Morin became one of the central figures. Morin was not a stranger passing through the community. He was known to the family. That familiarity made him visible to investigators. Once he entered the investigation, his actions, statements, and relationships were examined through the lens of suspicion. The problem was that suspicion can create its own momentum. Once investigators believe they may have found the person responsible, evidence can begin to appear more significant than it actually is. A coincidence becomes suspicious. An ambiguous statement becomes an apparent contradiction. A person's unusual behavior becomes evidence of guilt. The more investigators focus on one theory, the harder it can become to recognize information that points away from it. That danger was especially serious in Christine's case because the original investigation lacked the kind of forensic evidence that could conclusively establish the killeress' identity. There was no modern DNA match linking Morin to the murder. There was no scientific profile demonstrating that he was the source of the biological evidence. Yet the case moved forward. Morin was tried in 1986 and acquitted. The verdict was a major setback for the prosecution, but it did not end the legal battle. Prosecutors appealed, and the case returned to court. In the second trial, the prosecution again presented its evidence against Morin. In 1992, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For the public, the conviction appeared to resolve the murder, but the conviction did not answer the most important scientific question because the biological evidence had not yet been fully exploited. That would change as DNA technology developed. When investigators eventually tested the biological material associated with Christine's murder, the result was devastating to the prosecution's theory. The DNA did not match Morin. The scientific evidence pointed away from him. This was not merely another piece of circumstantial evidence. It was evidence capable of directly excluding him as the source of the biological material. The implications were enormous. If the DNA belonged to the man responsible for Christine's death, then the convicted man was not that person. Morin's conviction was eventually overturned, and in 1995, he was exonerated. The case had reached an extraordinary point. The justice system had convicted a man, and forensic science had shown that he was not the person connected to the biological evidence. An innocent man had spent years fighting for his freedom while the actual offender remained unidentified. The exoneration was a victory for Morin, but it was not a victory for the Jessup family. Their daughteress killer was still unknown. The biological profile that had helped clear Morin became the most important unresolved clue in the investigation. It was the genetic signature of an unknown man. Investigators searched available databases, but there was no match. The killer had disappeared into the population. He was no longer a suspect in an active investigation. He was a profile without a name. That was the point at which the case entered its longest period of silence. The family continued to live with the law. The investigation remained part of Canadian criminal history. Morin's wrongful conviction became a symbol of the dangers of tunnel vision, but the killer remained unidentified. For years, investigators could do little more than preserve the evidence and wait for technology to improve. Then the forensic world changed. Genetic genealogy began to transform the possibilities of cold case investigations. The technique offered a new way of approaching unidentified DNA. Traditional forensic searches depended heavily on direct database matches. If the offender had never been arrested or had never contributed DNA to a relevant database, the search could fail indefinitely. Genetic genealogy offered another route. Investigators could identify biological relatives of the unknown person and use those relationships to construct a family tree. The objective was not to accuse a relative. The objective was to narrow the possibilities until investigators could identify a specific individual and then confirm the connection through direct forensic testing. That distinction was essential. The genealogy created a lead. The DNA confirmation created the identification. Christina's case eventually entered this new forensic landscape. Investigators revisited the unknown DNA profile with methods that had not existed when the murder occurred. The search extended beyond traditional police records and into genetic relationships. Gradually, the possibilities narrowed. The trail eventually led to Calvin Hoover, But the name alone was not enough. Investigators needed to determine whether Hoover's DNA actually matched the profile recovered from the case. A direct comparison provided the crucial confirmation. Hoover was identified as the source of the DNA associated with Christine's murder. The mystery that had survived 36 years had finally been solved, but the discovery came with a devastating limitation. Hoover had died in 2015. He could not be arrested. He could not stand trial. He could not be confronted by Christine's family. There would be no confession. There would be no sentence. The legal system could not deliver the kind of final judgment that normally accompanies a murder investigation. Instead, the case reached its conclusion through forensic identification. That made the ending unusual, but it did not make the evidence less important. The identification gave investigators and the family the answer they had been denied for decades. It also gave Guy Paul Morin another measure of vindication. The man once convicted of Christine's murder had not been responsible. The real killer had been someone else, and the DNA had eventually revealed him. The case, therefore, exposed a painful paradox. The same investigation that had failed Christine and wrongly accused Morin ultimately produced one of the clearest examples of why forensic evidence matters. Human judgment had pointed toward the wrong man. Biological evidence had continued pointing toward the right one. The difference was time. In 1984, investigators did not have the tools necessary to read the DNA. In the 1990s, DNA testing became powerful enough to exclude Morin. In the 2020s, genetic genealogy became powerful enough to identify Hoover. The evidence had been there from the beginning. What changed was the ability to understand it. That is why the case remains so significant. It demonstrates that a cold case is not necessarily a case without evidence. Sometimes it is a case where the evidence has not yet become usable. The passage of time can make a murder more difficult to investigate, but it can also create new opportunities. Old samples can be tested again. Old records can be digitized. New databases can be searched. New forensic methods can be applied. A witness who could not remember a name may no longer be necessary if DNA can provide one. A suspect who once seemed impossible to identify can become visible through genetic relationships. Christine's case followed exactly that path. The original investigation had been dominated by human interpretation. The final breakthrough was dominated by science. But the emotional consequences of the earlier mistakes remain. Guy Paul Morin had been forced to live with the consequences of a wrongful conviction. Christine's family had been forced to live without their daughter while her killer remained unidentified. The actual offender had died before investigators could bring him into court. Every stage of the case carried a different form of law. Even the final solution could not undo it. For the Jessup family, knowing the killer's identity could never be the same as having Christine back. For Morin, being exonerated could never restore the years lost to imprisonment and suspicion. And for investigators, solving the case decades later could never change the fact that the wrong man had once been convicted. The truth had arrived, but it arrived after enormous damage had already been done. That reality is what makes the case so haunting. The story does not fit neatly into a simple narrative of crime followed by justice. Instead, it is a story of disappearance, investigation, accusation, conviction, exoneration, technological transformation, and eventual identification. It is a story in which the truth survived despite human error. The DNA did not become more truthful with time. It was always truthful. The investigators simply became capable of hearing what it was saying. When Calvin Hoover was identified, the mystery surrounding Christine's murder finally had an answer. But the case also became a permanent reminder of how fragile an investigation can be when assumptions replace proof. Christine deserved justice. Morin deserved to remain free, and the truth deserved to be pursued without being forced to fit a convenient theory. Decades later, science finally separated those three truths and placed them where they belonged. The killer was identified. The innocent man was cleared, and Christine's murder was no longer an unanswered question. But the scars left by the years in between could never be erased. The case had now entered a phase that would have been unimaginable when Christine Jessup disappeared in 1984. 4 decades, investigators had searched for a person they could not name. Then, in 2020, the unknown DNA profile finally pointed toward Calvin Hoover, a man who had already died. The discovery solved the central mystery, but it also forced investigators and the public to look at the entire history of the case again. Every old assumption had to be reconsidered. Every investigative decision had to be viewed against the evidence that ultimately emerged. And at the center of that history was Guy Paul Moran, the man who had spent years carrying the weight of a murder he did not commit. Christine's story could not be separated from his. When investigators first focused on Moran, they were trying to answer a terrifying question. Who had killed a 12-year-old girl? Moran lived in the same community and was known to the Jessup family. His proximity made him visible. His connection to Christine made him relevant. But visibility is not guilt, and relevance is not proof. Yet, as the investigation progressed, Moran became the person around whom the theory of the case was constructed. The prosecution ultimately relied on circumstantial evidence, and the absence of decisive forensic proof became less important than the broader narrative built around him. In 1986, a jury acquitted him, but the case did not end. The prosecution appealed, and a second trial followed. In 1992, Moran was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The conviction created the appearance of closure. A name had been attached to the crime. The public could believe the killer had been found. But the physical evidence had never stopped pointing elsewhere. The biological material associated with Christine's murder existed independently of the courtroom theory. When DNA testing eventually became available, it provided a result that changed everything. The biological profile did not match Moran. The man convicted of Christine's murder was not the source of the DNA. That finding eventually led to Moran's exoneration in 1995. It also created a disturbing new reality. The real killer was still unknown. The investigation had to begin again, this time without the assumption that Moran was responsible. The unknown DNA profile became the foundation of the renewed search. Investigators could now say with scientific confidence that the biological material belonged to another man. But identifying that man was another challenge entirely. The profile was searched against available databases, but no direct match appeared. The case entered a long period in which the evidence was powerful, but the identity remained hidden. That period would last for decades. Christina's family continued to live with the consequences. The original crime had happened when Christine was 12. The search for her killer continued long after the child she had been would have become an adult. Years became decades. The investigation became part of Canadian criminal history. Moran's exoneration became a major lesson in wrongful conviction. But the Jessup family still lacked the one piece of information they wanted most: the name of the person responsible. The emergence of genetic genealogy changed the possibility. Modern genetic genealogy could search for biological relatives of an unknown person. Investigators could use those relationships to reconstruct family connections and narrow the potential identity of an offender. This was especially valuable in cases where traditional law enforcement DNA databases had failed. A person did not necessarily need to have a criminal record or a previous DNA profile for investigators to begin locating him. His relatives might provide the necessary path. The method required careful analysis. Investigators had to distinguish between genetic relatives and the actual offender. They had to construct family trees. They had to eliminate individuals who could not have committed the crime. And ultimately, they had to obtain direct DNA confirmation. In Christina's case, the process eventually led investigators to who. The identification was then confirmed through forensic comparison. The DNA associated with the murder was linked to him. 36 years after Christine disappeared, investigators could finally name the man responsible. The breakthrough was extraordinary, but the circumstances surrounding Hoover's death meant that there would be no traditional criminal prosecution. He had died in 2015. Investigators could identify him, but they could not bring him before a court. There would be no arrest photograph, no arraignment, no trial, no sentencing hearing. The evidence would have to serve as the final answer. For the Jessup family, that meant the case could be resolved without the kind of courtroom ending that television crime stories often portray. There was no dramatic confession. There was no moment when the killer admitted what he had done. There was simply the scientific conclusion that the biological evidence pointed to Hoover. The reality was quieter, but no less significant. The investigation had finally reached the truth, yet the identification also highlighted the extraordinary consequences of the earlier wrongful conviction. Morin had lost years of his life. He had been publicly associated with a childless murder. His family had experienced the consequences, and while all of that was happening, the actual offender remained unidentified. The case became a warning about the danger of tunnel vision. Investigators are human. They must make decisions with incomplete information, but once a suspect becomes the center of a case, there is a risk that investigators begin looking for evidence that confirms their theory rather than evidence that tests it. Christine's murder became an example of why those distinctions matter. The DNA evidence eventually broke through the assumptions. It did not simply point to Hoover. It proved that Morin could not have been the source of the biological material. That scientific exclusion was crucial. It allowed investigators to separate the wrongful conviction from the actual homicide. It also demonstrated why evidence must be preserved even when it does not immediately solve a case. If the biological material had been discarded, contaminated, or lost, the future breakthrough might never have happened. Instead, the evidence survived. It remained available while forensic science advanced. This is one of the most important lessons from cold cases. Investigators cannot always predict what evidence will become useful. A fingerprint that cannot be matched today may become identifiable tomorrow. A DNA profile with no database match may become useful when databases expand. A photograph may acquire new significance when investigators discover where it was taken. Preservation creates possibilities. Christine's case depended on that principle. The biological evidence survived decades of uncertainty and eventually became the key to the identity of the killer. The breakthrough also showed how dramatically forensic investigations had changed since 1984. When Christine disappeared, investigators could not have imagined using genetic genealogy to trace an unknown killer through biological relatives. The tools simply did not exist. By 2020, they had become powerful enough to transform the case. That technological progression is part of what makes the story so striking. The crime remained the same. Christine's DNA did not change. The evidence did not become different. What changed was the ability of investigators to extract information from it. Science had caught up with the case, and when it did, the identity of the killer emerged. But solving the case did not answer every question. Because Hoover was dead, investigators could not establish every detail of what happened through a criminal trial. The family could not ask him why Christine had been targeted. They could not demand an explanation. They could not hear his version of events. The forensic evidence could identify him, but it could not reconstruct every moment of Christine's final hours. Some uncertainty remained. That is another painful reality of cold cases. Even when the central mystery is solved, smaller mysteries may remain forever. A family may know who killed their loved one, but never know exactly what the offender was thinking. They may know where the evidence points, but never hear a confession. They may know the truth without receiving every answer. For Christine's family, the most important answer was nevertheless finally available. The man responsible was no longer unknown. The decades of uncertainty had ended. The name Calvin Hoover entered the official history of the case, and with that name came a second truth. Guy Paul Morin had not murdered Christine. The case that had once destroyed his life had eventually produced evidence that cleared him. Those two conclusions were inseparable. One could not exist without the other. The identification of Hoover was not simply a forensic breakthrough. It was also a correction to a grave injustice. That correction could not restore Morin's lost years, but it could restore the historical record. The truth about Christine's murder was finally different from the story that had been told in the courtroom decades earlier. The killer was not the man who had been convicted. The killer was the man whose DNA had remained unidentified for years. The case had traveled from one conclusion to another, and the final conclusion was supported by evidence that did not depend on memory or theory. It depended on genetics. In the end, the most persistent witness in Christine's case was not a person. It was the biological evidence left behind. It survived the investigation. It survived the trial. It survived the wrongful conviction. It survived the exoneration. It survived the death of the actual killer. And when investigators finally had the tools to interpret it, it revealed the truth. 36 years after Christine disappeared, the mystery was finally broken. But the story of how that truth emerged was just as important as the identity itself. It was a story about what happens when science is allowed to challenge assumptions, when evidence is preserved, and when investigators refuse to accept that, the passage of time means a case is beyond hope. Christine's killer had remained hidden for decades. He had not remained hidden from the evidence. The evidence had been waiting. The years after Guy Paul Moran's exoneration created a strange silence around Christine Jessup's murder. The case was no longer dominated by a single suspect. Instead, it was dominated by an absence. There was no killeress name, no arrest, no conviction, no explanation that could withstand the evidence. There was only the DNA profile recovered from the investigation, a biological fingerprint belonging to an unknown man. For the Jessup family, that unknown identity became a permanent wound. They knew their daughter had been murdered. They knew the man once convicted had not done it. But they did not know who had actually taken Christine's life. The investigation had entered what seemed like an endless waiting period. Yet cold cases often survive in ways that are invisible to the public. Evidence is stored. Files remain. Names are recorded. Laboratory results can be preserved for decades. Detectives retire, but their work remains. And when technology changes, an old file can suddenly become active again. Christine's case was one of those files. The biological evidence was not forgotten. It was preserved. The unknown profile remained available for future testing, and that decision would eventually prove crucial. In the years after Moran's exoneration, traditional DNA database searches did not identify the offender. Investigators had a profile, but there was no corresponding name. The offender had apparently never provided a matching sample to the relevant system. That meant the most powerful clue in the case could not, by itself, produce an identity. The search remained incomplete. The killer had left biological evidence behind, but he had left no obvious digital fingerprint that investigators could immediately follow. The situation was frustrating because the science had already established one important fact. The man who supplied the DNA was not Guy Paul Moran. But knowing who the killer was not did not tell investigators who he was. This distinction became the foundation of the next phase of the case. Investigators needed a new strategy. They needed a way to use the DNA without waiting for a direct criminal database match. That strategy eventually came from genetic genealogy. The rise of consumer genealogy databases and advanced genetic analysis created new possibilities for identifying unknown individuals through relatives. Investigators could examine an unidentified genetic profile and search for family connections. A distant relative might reveal an ancestral line. Multiple relatives could reveal overlapping branches. Those branches could be reconstructed into a family tree. And somewhere within that tree could be the person whose DNA matched the crime scene evidence. It was a revolutionary change in cold case investigation because it transformed an unidentified person into a genealogical problem. The unknown killer did not have to be sitting in a police database. His family might already be there. His relatives might unknowingly hold the key to his identity. This method had to be used carefully. A genetic connection alone could not establish guilt. Investigators needed to build the family relationships and then confirm the suspected individual with direct forensic DNA testing. But the method offered something that traditional searches could not: a path forward when the offender himself was absent from law enforcement records. Christine's case became a candidate for this approach because the original DNA evidence was still available and sufficiently useful. The case had survived long enough for technology to catch up with it. Investigators began working through the genetic information. The search was not a dramatic moment with a single database hit. It was a process of narrowing possibilities. The biological profile pointed toward relatives. The relatives pointed toward family lines. The family lines pointed toward possible individuals. Each step reduced uncertainty. Each step brought the investigation closer to a name. Eventually, investigators reached Calvin Hoover. The name did not carry the same history as Guy Paul Moran's name. Hoover had not been the central figure in the original investigation. He had not been convicted of Christine's murder. His identification emerged from the forensic trail rather than from the original theory. That difference was crucial. The investigation was no longer asking who seemed suspicious. It was asking whose DNA matched the biological evidence. When investigators obtained a direct comparison, the answer became clear. Hoover was linked to the DNA profile associated with Christine's murder. After 36 years, the unknown man had finally been identified. The breakthrough was announced in 2020, and the case moved from unresolved to solved. But the announcement came with an unusual and deeply painful fact. Hoover had died in 2015. The man investigators identified as responsible for Christine's murder was already dead. That meant the case could never reach a conventional criminal trial. There would be no opportunity for prosecutors to present the evidence against him before a jury. There would be no defense argument. There would be no sentence. The identification, therefore, represented the end of one kind of mystery, but not the beginning of a traditional legal process. The evidence had answered the question of identity, but it could not provide every detail about motive or circumstances. The family could know who was responsible without knowing everything that happened inside the offender's mind. That uncertainty would remain. But the central question had been answered. The identification of Hoover also forced a reconsideration of the years in which Moran had been suspected and convicted. The contrast was stark. One man had been accused without conclusive physical evidence. Another man had been identified through the biological evidence itself. The difference demonstrated how investigative methods can evolve. In the early years, detectives had relied on circumstances and interpretations. In the final years, they relied on genetics and direct scientific comparison. The case, therefore, became a historical example of why forensic evidence must be preserved and why investigators must remain willing to revisit old conclusions. The original investigation had not been able to identify Hoover, but it had collected evidence that would eventually identify him decades later. The evidence outlived the investigation's original assumptions. It outlived the first trial. It outlived the second trial. It outlived the wrongful conviction. It outlived the exoneration. And it even outlived the killer himself. That is what made the final breakthrough so extraordinary. Hoover was dead, but his genetic signature remained. The case had waited for technology rather than for the offender. For Christine's family, the announcement in 2020 was therefore both an answer and a reminder of everything they had endured. They had spent decades without knowing who had killed their daughter. The person responsible had lived through much of that period without being publicly identified. He had eventually died, still outside the reach of a criminal courtroom. The family could not recover the years that had passed. They could not ask Hoover to explain himself. They could not hear a confession, but they could finally stop wondering whether the truth would ever be known. That mattered. There is a particular kind of torment in an unresolved murder. Every anniversary can reopen the question. Every unidentified person can become a possibility. Every new cold case headline can create hope and fear at the same time. Families learn to live with uncertainty because there is no alternative. Christine's family had lived with that uncertainty for 36 years. The identification of Hoover changed the emotional landscape. The uncertainty about the killer's identity was gone. What remained was grief. The case also became a powerful example of the importance of wrongful conviction review. Moran's exoneration had demonstrated that a conviction is not necessarily the end of an investigation. New evidence can force the justice system to reconsider conclusions that once appeared final. DNA had done exactly that. It had first cleared Moran and then, decades later, helped identify Hoover. The same evidence had played two opposite roles in the history of the case. First, it showed who was not responsible. Then it helped establish who was. That progression demonstrated the unique value of forensic science. A DNA profile does not need to tell investigators everything to be useful. Sometimes its first role is exclusion. Eliminating an innocent person can be just as important as identifying a guilty one. In Christine's case, that exclusion prevented the wrongful conviction from remaining permanent. The later identification then redirected the historical narrative toward the actual offender. The story also demonstrated the limits of forensic technology. DNA could identify Hoover, but it could not recreate every moment of Christine's final hours. It could not tell the family everything they wanted to know. It could not bring Christine back. It could not erase Moran's years of imprisonment. It could not create a courtroom ending after the suspect's death. Science could reveal identity, but it could not repair every consequence of the crime. That is why the conclusion of the case remained emotionally complicated. A headline might say that the murder was finally solved, and technically it was. But solving a murder is not the same thing as undoing it. Christine was still gone. Her family still carried the loss. Morin still carried the history of being wrongfully accused and convicted. The community still had to confront the fact that the truth had taken decades to emerge. Yet the identification of Hoover represented something that had once seemed impossible: certainty. The unknown DNA profile finally had a name. The cold case finally had an answer. The evidence had crossed the distance of 36 years and connected a biological trace from a 12-year-old girl's murder to a man who had never been convicted of the crime. The technology that made the identification possible did not exist when Christine disappeared. But the evidence did. It waited in storage. It remained unchanged. And when the right tools finally arrived, it became the key that opened the case. The mystery had not vanished. It had been hidden for 36 years. The answer was buried in the evidence. In 2020, investigators finally found it. By the time investigators finally identified Calvin Hoover, the Christine Jessup case had become more than a cold case. It had become a record of everything that can happen when a murder remains unsolved for decades. An innocent man convicted, a family forced to live with uncertainty, evidence preserved through changing generations of forensic science, and a killer whose identity remained hidden until technology finally caught up with him. But the breakthrough did not happen because investigators suddenly discovered a forgotten witness or found a hidden confession. It happened because the biological evidence had survived long enough to become useful in a completely different era of criminal investigation. That distinction is critical. Christine's murder had never been truly silent. The evidence had been speaking from the beginning. What changed was the ability to understand it. In the years following Guy Paul Morin's exoneration, investigators knew that the DNA profile connected to Christina's murder belonged to a man other than Morin. That fact should have permanently changed the direction of the investigation. The biological evidence had already demonstrated that the original theory was wrong. But knowing that the killer was another man did not immediately reveal who that man was. Traditional DNA searching could only go as far as the databases available to investigators. If the unknown profile did not correspond to a person whose DNA was already stored in a relevant system, there was no name waiting on the other side of the search. The result was an investigative dead end. The killer had left a genetic signature, but there was no identity attached to it. Canada's National DNA Data Bank had been established in 2000 years after Christine's murder, creating a national system for storing and comparing DNA profiles related to designated offenses. Its later expansion also created additional indices designed to assist with missing person investigations and unidentified human remains. But even the growth of forensic databases could not guarantee that an unknown offender would appear inside them. A person could leave biological evidence at a crime scene and still remain invisible if investigators had no matching reference profile. That was the problem confronting Christine's case. The evidence existed. The technology was improving, but the name was still missing. Then the science of genetic genealogy began opening a new door. The fundamental idea was simple but powerful. An unknown DNA profile did not necessarily need to match the offender directly in a criminal database. It could reveal relatives. Those relatives could reveal a family. The family could reveal generations of connections. And those connections could eventually lead investigators toward the person whose DNA had been recovered from the crime. The process required careful genealogical research and, ultimately, direct forensic confirmation. A family connection was not the same as proof of guilt. It was an investigative lead. But for cold cases where conventional DNA searches had failed, that lead could be transformative. Christine's case was particularly suited to such a strategy because the evidence had already established a clear biological profile belonging to an unknown male. Investigators did not have to begin with a blank page. They had a genetic starting point. The challenge was finding the path from that profile to a living or deceased individual. The search moved beyond the assumptions that had shaped the original investigation. It no longer depended on asking who had seemed suspicious in 1984. It did not depend on which neighbor had attracted attention. It did not depend on which theory had appeared convincing during the trials. The DNA provided a different kind of question. Where did this genetic profile come from? Who was biologically connected to it? And where did those relationships lead? The investigation could now move backward through generations instead of simply backward through police files. Every relationship became another piece of the puzzle. Every branch of a family could narrow the possibility. Every individual who could be eliminated reduced the remaining field. Eventually, the investigation led toward Calvin Hoover. But even then, investigators needed more than a genealogical connection. The scientific standard required confirmation. The suspected individual had to be compared directly with the forensic evidence. The comparison connected Hoover to the DNA associated with Christine's murder. After 36 years, the unknown profile finally had a name. It was a moment that transformed the entire history of the case. The man who had been invisible to investigators for decades was no longer invisible. The biological evidence had finally reached an identity, but the identity came with a terrible complication. Hoover had died in 2015. The investigators who identified him could not arrest him. Prosecutors could not bring him into court. There would be no trial in which the evidence could be presented against him. There would be no opportunity to hear him deny the accusation or confess to the crime. There would be no sentence. The man identified through the DNA evidence was already beyond the reach of the criminal justice system. For the Jessup family, this meant the long-awaited answer. Arrived in an unusual form, they finally knew who investigators had identified as responsible for Christine's murder, but they could not ask him why. They could not demand an explanation for what had happened on that October day in 1984. They could not hear what had been hidden for 36 years. The identity was there. The full story was not. And that difference matters because solving a homicide does not necessarily mean solving every mystery surrounding it. DNA can establish a biological connection. It cannot always reveal motive. It cannot reconstruct every thought. It cannot tell a family everything that happened inside the mind of a killer. It can identify. It can exclude. It can connect. But it cannot undo the past. For Christine's family, the past was permanent. Their daughter had been 12 years old when she disappeared. She never reached adulthood. She never experienced the years that followed. She never saw the technological revolution that would eventually reveal the person responsible for her death. Her family lived those decades instead, carrying a question that refused to disappear. Who killed Christine? That question had once been answered incorrectly. Then it had been left unanswered. Finally, it was answered through science. The journey from Morin to Hoover revealed a disturbing contrast. Morin had been placed at the center of the investigation through circumstances and interpretation. Hoover was identified decades later through biological evidence. The difference between the two men represented the difference between suspicion and proof. One had been convicted and later exonerated. The other had never faced a courtroom but was identified through the DNA associated with the crime. That contrast became one of the most important lessons of the case. An investigation can produce a conviction without necessarily producing the truth. A cold case can remain unresolved even when investigators possess critical evidence. And an innocent person can become the focus of a homicide investigation when circumstantial evidence is interpreted too confidently. Christine's case demonstrated all three realities. The wrongful conviction of Morin was not simply an unfortunate detour. It became part of the permanent history of the murder. His exoneration proved that the original conclusion had been wrong. The later identification of Hoover explained why it had been wrong. The biological evidence had always belonged to another man. It simply took decades before investigators could determine who that man was. The case, therefore, became an extraordinary example of why forensic evidence must be preserved. Evidence collected in one generation may become decisive in another. Investigators cannot always know what technology will exist 20 years later. A sample that seems limited today may become extraordinarily valuable tomorrow. A database that contains nothing useful today may contain a crucial relative years later. A forensic profile that once produced no match may eventually become the key to an entire family tree. The passage of time does not automatically destroy evidence. Sometimes it only delays its meaning. That is exactly what happened here. The biological evidence remained while everything around it changed. Investigators changed. Technology changed. Databases changed. The legal history of the case changed. Guy Paul Morin went from suspect to accused, from accused to convicted prisoner, and finally to exonerated man. The identity of the real killer remained unknown throughout those transformations, yet the DNA remained consistent. It did not change its story. It simply waited. When investigators finally announced the identification in 2020, the case entered a new historical chapter. The murder of Christine Jessup was no longer an unidentified homicide. The name connected to the biological evidence had been established. The case could finally be described as solved. But the word solved carried a complicated meaning. It meant that investigators had identified the man responsible through the evidence. It did not mean Christine's family could erase the years of grief. It did not mean Morin could recover the time lost to wrongful imprisonment. It did not mean every unanswered question had disappeared. And it certainly did not mean that the crime itself could ever be undone. Justice and closure are not always the same thing. Sometimes justice means establishing the truth. Sometimes it means correcting a wrongful conviction. Sometimes it means giving a family the name they have waited decades to hear. In Christine's case, all three became part of the ending. The truth was finally established through DNA. Morin was cleared, and the family finally learned who the investigation had identified as Christine's killer. But there was another consequence, one that reached beyond the Jessup family. The case became a warning to future investigators. Cold cases should not be judged only by how long they have remained unsolved. They should be judged by what evidence still exists and what new methods may eventually be available. The passage of time can be an enemy, but it can also be an unexpected ally. Every year brings new technology. Every decade creates new databases. Every scientific advancement creates another possibility for evidence that once seemed useless. Christine's murder survived long enough to benefit from that evolution. The evidence survived. The investigation survived. And eventually, the truth emerged. For 36 years, the identity of Christine's killer had been hidden behind an unknown DNA profile. In the end, it was not a forgotten confession or a sudden eyewitness who broke the mystery. It was the genetic evidence left behind in the original investigation. The evidence had survived the wrongful conviction. It had survived Morin's exoneration. It had survived the death of the man eventually identified through it. And when the science finally became capable of following the trail, the unknown man became Calvin Hoover. The mystery had a name. The cold case had an answer. But the silence surrounding Christine's death had left another question hanging over everything. What did her family lose during those 36 years while the truth remained hidden? 36 years is an almost unimaginable amount of time to wait for an answer about a child's murder. By the time investigators identified Calvin Hoover in 2020, Christine Jessup had been gone for most of a lifetime. The 12-year-old girl who disappeared in 1984 had become a name preserved in photographs, family memories, police records, court documents, and a forensic profile that refused to disappear. Her murder had crossed generations of investigators. It had survived a wrongful conviction, an exoneration, changing forensic technology, and the death of the man eventually identified through the evidence. Yet for Christine's family, time did not make the central question less important. It made the absence of an answer harder to carry. When a homicide remains unsolved, the uncertainty can become part of everyday life. There is no final explanation to organize the grief around. There is no confirmed offender whose identity can be attached to the law. There is only the knowledge that someone caused the death and that the person responsible has not been held accountable. For the Jessup family, that uncertainty lasted decades. And even after the DNA breakthrough, the emotional consequences of those years remained. Christine was 12 when she disappeared. She should have grown old. She should have entered adulthood. She should have experienced the ordinary stages of life that her family watched other children experience. Instead, her life ended before any of those possibilities could happen. The investigation could eventually identify the man responsible, But it could not restore those missing years. It could not give Christine back to her family. It could not erase the pain of October 1984. It could not reverse the years in which investigators pursued the wrong man. That is why the story of Christine Jessup cannot be reduced to the headline that the case was finally solved. The headline is powerful, but the history beneath it is much darker. The murder exposed how an investigation can become trapped by a theory and how an innocent person can suffer when circumstantial evidence is treated as more convincing than it should be. Guy Paul Morin's experience became inseparable from Christine's story. Morin had been accused, tried, acquitted, retried, convicted, imprisoned, and eventually exonerated. His name became connected to a murder he had not committed. For years, the legal system treated him as the answer, but the DNA eventually demonstrated that the answer was somewhere else. That revelation changed more than Morin's legal status. It changed the meaning of the entire investigation. The case could no longer be understood as the story of a murder committed by Morin. It had to be understood as the story of a murder in which Morin had been wrongly accused while the actual offender remained unidentified. The biological evidence became the dividing line between those two realities. Before DNA testing, investigators had a theory. After DNA testing, they had a scientific exclusion. That exclusion was powerful because it did not depend on whether investigators believed Morin's statements or whether the public found him suspicious. It depended on genetic evidence. The DNA associated with Christine's murder did not match him. That fact eventually cleared him. But it also created a new investigative problem. The profile belonged to an unknown man. The case was therefore not solved. It had simply been corrected. The wrong person was removed from the center, but the right person was still missing. This is one of the most important distinctions in cold case investigations. Exoneration and resolution are not the same thing. Clearing an innocent person can reveal an investigative failure without identifying the guilty person. In Christina's case, that gap lasted for years. Traditional database searches did not immediately provide a match. The biological profile remained without a name. Investigators could preserve it, analyze it, and search it, but the offender remained beyond reach. The passage of time created an almost surreal situation. The evidence existed, but the person connected to it did not appear in the systems investigators could search. The case remained open in the sense that the mystery was unresolved, but there was no obvious suspect to pursue. Then the forensic landscape changed again. Genetic genealogy created new possibilities for unidentified DNA profile. Instead of searching only for a direct match, investigators could look for genetic relatives. The unknown profile could be connected to family lines. Those family lines could be reconstructed. The resulting genealogical research could narrow the field toward a specific person. The approach required care because relatives are not offenders simply because they share DNA. Genetic relationships create investigative leads, not automatic conclusions. Direct forensic comparison remained essential. In Christina's case, however, the new method provided something the investigation had lacked for decades: a route from an unknown genetic profile toward a real individual. That route eventually led to Calvin Hoover. The significance of the identification was enormous. Hoover had not been the man convicted in Christine's murder. He had not been the subject of the original courtroom narrative. His identity emerged from the DNA itself. Investigators were able to connect him to the biological evidence associated with the crime. After 36 years, the unknown offender finally had a name, but the answer came too late for a prosecution. Hoover had died in 2015. The man identified through the forensic evidence was no longer alive when investigators reached him. There could be no arrest. There could be no interrogation. There could be no trial. There could be no sentence. That reality gave the resolution a painful finality. The family finally knew who investigators had identified as responsible, but they could never confront him. They could never hear him explain what happened. They could never ask him why Christine. They could never listen to a confession. The forensic evidence could establish identity, but it could not provide the complete human explanation that families often seek after a murder. This is where the difference between solving a case and achieving emotional closure becomes impossible to ignore. A solved case may provide a name. Closure, if it comes at all, is much more complicated. For Christine's family, the name Calvin Hoover could answer one question, but it could not answer every question. It could not tell them what Christine experienced in her final moments. It could not give them back the daughter they lost. It could not remove the memories of the years spent waiting. It could not erase the knowledge that another man had once been convicted for the crime. It could not undo the damage caused by the investigation's original failures, yet the identification still mattered. It restored a crucial truth. It established that the man responsible was not moral. It gave the family a factual answer after decades of uncertainty. And it demonstrated that the evidence collected in 1984 had retained its value. That evidence had crossed the decades without changing its identity. Human memories faded. Investigators retired. Court proceedings ended. Technology changed, but the biological evidence remained. It became a kind of silent witness, one that could not be intimidated, forgotten, or persuaded. Its meaning became clearer as forensic science advanced. In the beginning, it could not identify anyone. Later, it could exclude Moran. Eventually, it could identify Hoover. The progression was remarkable. The same evidence had played 3 different roles across the history of the case. First, an unresolved clue, then a tool of exoneration, and finally the key to identification. The case therefore became an extraordinary lesson in the importance of preserving evidence. Investigators in 1984 could not have known what technology would exist decades later. They could not have predicted the rise of forensic databases, advanced DNA profiling, or genetic genealogy. But because biological evidence survived, future investigators had something to work with. That principle reaches far beyond Christine's case. Cold case investigators often depend on evidence collected by people who could never have imagined the tools available to investigators decades later. A sample preserved correctly can become more valuable with time. A forensic profile that produces no match today may become decisive when databases expand. A case that seems impossible can become solvable when science changes the question. Christine's murder followed that pattern exactly. The original investigation asked who among the people connected to the case might be responsible. The later investigation asked what the DNA could reveal. Those are fundamentally different questions. The first depends heavily on human judgment. The second begins with biological evidence. The ultimate breakthrough came when investigators followed the second path. But the story also carries a warning. Science cannot automatically correct every investigative mistake. It can reveal contradictions. It can exclude suspects. It can identify individuals. But the system must be willing to listen when the evidence challenges an established theory. Christine's case demonstrates what happens when that willingness comes too late. Moran's wrongful conviction showed the cost of certainty without sufficient proof. His exoneration showed the importance of forensic review. Hoover's identification showed what can happen when investigators return to old evidence with new tools. Together, those events created a case unlike almost any other. A 12-year-old girl disappeared. A murdered child was found. An innocent man became the accused. A conviction followed. DNA overturned it. Decades passed. Genetic genealogy reopened the path. And finally, the biological evidence identified the actual offender. The timeline was long, painful, and deeply human. It showed that justice can move slowly, sometimes painfully slowly. It also showed that an unresolved case does not necessarily mean an unanswered case forever. The truth can survive in places investigators cannot immediately reach. It can remain in a laboratory freezer. It can remain in a database. It can remain in an old photograph. It can remain in a family tree. It can remain in DNA. And sometimes, decades later, that evidence can speak with a clarity that human memory never could. Christine's case eventually reached that moment. The unknown man was no longer unknown. The wrongful conviction was no longer the final chapter. The evidence had finally connected the murder to the person responsible. Yet the emotional weight of the case remained. Christina's family had waited 36 years for an answer, and no answer could ever be large enough to fill the space created by her death. The breakthrough did not erase the tragedy. It simply ended one form of uncertainty. The question who killed Christine Jessup finally had an answer. But the question what might Christine's life have become if she had come home that day could never be answered by DNA, genealogy, a courtroom, or any investigation. That was the loss at the heart of the case. The science could identify the killer. It could not restore the future that had been taken from her. The identification of Calvin Hoover in 2020 finally gave the Christine Jessup investigation something it had lacked for 36 years. A name attached to the biological evidence. But the discovery also forced investigators, journalists, legal experts, and the public to confront a difficult truth. Solving the murder did not mean that the damage caused by the original investigation could simply disappear. Christine was still dead. Her family had still endured decades of uncertainty, and Guy Paul Morin had still spent years of his life fighting a conviction for a crime he did not commit. The final DNA breakthrough therefore became more than a story about a killer being identified. It became a story about the extraordinary power of forensic evidence to correct a narrative that had once gone badly wrong. When Christine disappeared in 1984, nobody could have predicted that the investigation would eventually become one of Canada's most important examples of both wrongful conviction and forensic exoneration. She was 12 years old. Her disappearance began with an ordinary trip to return a library book. Then she failed to come home. The search that followed would eventually lead investigators to her body, to a murder investigation, and to a suspect who would become trapped inside the case for years. Morin was eventually convicted, but the evidence that ultimately mattered most had never truly pointed toward him. DNA testing later demonstrated that the biological material associated with Christine's murder came from another man. Morin was exonerated, yet the actual offender remained unknown. That unknown profile became one of the most important pieces of evidence in Canadian cold case history. For years, it produced no direct match. The technology available to investigators could establish the existence of the profile, but could not tell them whose DNA it was. That limitation is important because it explains why the case remained unresolved for so long. It was not necessarily that investigators had no evidence. They had evidence that they could not yet convert into an identity. The difference between those two situations is enormous. A cold case can contain a powerful forensic clue and still remain unsolved because the databases, laboratory methods, or investigative tools needed to interpret that clue do not yet exist. Christina's murder demonstrated exactly that problem. The evidence survived while the technology evolved. Eventually, genetic genealogy created a new possibility. Instead of waiting for the unknown DNA to appear in a conventional law enforcement database, investigators could explore genetic relationships and use them to identify potential family connections. The process was painstaking. It required investigators to examine genetic relationships, construct family connections, eliminate people who could not have been responsible, and then confirm the final candidate through direct forensic comparison. It was not enough to find someone who belonged to the right family. The evidence had to connect the individual directly to the DNA profile associated with the crime. That process eventually led to Hoover. By 2020, investigators could publicly identify him as the man whose DNA was linked to Christine's murder, but Hoover had died in 2015. The breakthrough, therefore, came without the conventional ending of an arrest and trial. The man identified through the evidence was already dead. There could be no courtroom where prosecutors would present the case to a juror. There could be no defense attorney challenging the evidence. There could be no sentence. There could be no confession. What remained was the forensic conclusion and the historical significance of the identification. For Christine's family, that distinction must have been profound. For decades, they had lived with an unanswered question. Now the question of identity had an answer, but the man who could have provided explanations was gone. There would be no opportunity to ask him what happened to Christine. No opportunity to ask why he had targeted her. No opportunity to hear the story from his own voice. The DNA could establish a connection, but it could not provide every detail the family might have wanted to know. That is one of the cruelest features of a cold case solution. The truth can arrive long after the people who could explain it are gone. Sometimes the victim is gone. Sometimes the witnesses are gone. Sometimes the investigators who first worked the case are gone. Sometimes even the offender is gone, yet the evidence can remain. Christine's case demonstrated the importance of preserving that evidence because the biological material eventually became the foundation for the entire resolution. Without the original evidence, the later technology would have had nothing to examine. The investigators of 1984 could not have known that decades later, forensic genealogy would transform the investigation. They could not have predicted the databases that would exist or the methods that would be developed. They could only preserve what they found. That preservation became a bridge between two completely different eras of criminal investigation. The first era depended heavily on traditional police work, interviews, circumstantial evidence, and physical clues that were limited by the technology of the time. The later era could combine DNA analysis with genetic databases and genealogical research. Christina's murder connected those two eras in a way that made the case historically significant. The DNA that eventually identified Hoover had another important consequence. It reinforced the truth of Morin's exoneration. For years, Morin's name had been associated with the murder. He had endured 2 trials. He had been acquitted once and convicted later. His conviction was eventually overturned after DNA evidence excluded him. The eventual identification of Hoover provided an even clearer explanation of why the biological evidence had contradicted the original prosecution theory. Morin had not been the source of the DNA because the DNA belonged to someone else. The discovery, therefore, did not simply solve Christine's murder. It also completed another chapter in the story of Morin's wrongful conviction. The case became a warning about the danger of investigative tunnel vision. Tunnel vision does not necessarily begin with malicious intent. Investigators can become convinced that they are pursuing the right person because several circumstances appear to fit. Once that belief becomes established, however, there is a danger that contradictory evidence will be interpreted as less important. The investigation can become a search for confirmation rather than a search for truth. Christine's murder showed the consequences of that danger with devastating clarity. A man who was not the killer became the center of the prosecution, while the actual offender remained outside the investigation's reach. The eventual DNA evidence forced the system to confront that failure. Science had no interest in protecting the original theory. It simply produced a result. The biological profile did not match Morin. That was enough to change the case. The later genetic genealogy work continued the same process. It did not ask who investigators had previously suspected. It asked what the evidence could reveal now. That difference became decisive. The final identification of Hoover also demonstrated why cold case investigations can suddenly move after decades of apparent inactivity. From the outside, a case can appear frozen. There may be no press conference, no arrest, and no visible development. But inside forensic laboratories and investigative files, evidence can remain available for future examination. When new technology appears, an old case can become new again. The passage of time can actually create opportunities that did not exist when the crime occurred. Databases grow. Genetic records expand. Analytical methods improve. Investigators develop new strategies. The case does not become younger, but the tools used to investigate it become more powerful. Christine's murder benefited from that transformation. The case that could not be solved in 1984 was approached differently decades later. The biological evidence that could not identify the offender in the 1990s eventually became useful for genetic genealogy. And the genetic trail that had once ended with an unknown profile eventually led to who. The breakthrough also changed the meaning of the phrase cold case. A cold case is often imagined as a file sitting untouched in a dark room, gathering dust. Christine's case showed something very different. A cold case can remain active beneath the surface. It can exist as preserved evidence, stored records, unanswered questions, and investigators who refuse to accept that. The truth is permanently unreachable. Technology can reopen a case without changing the original crime. It can transform what investigators are able to do with evidence collected decades earlier. In Christina's case, that transformation ultimately produced the identity of the man connected to her murder. Yet the emotional ending remained complicated. For Christine's family, the identification could bring certainty. But certainty did not mean happiness. It did not mean the loss suddenly became bearable. It did not mean 36 years of questions disappeared. It simply meant that one of the most painful unknowns had finally been removed. They knew the investigation had identified the man responsible. They knew the biological evidence had survived. They knew the person once convicted was not the killer. And they knew that the truth had finally emerged through forensic science. That was significant, even if it could never be enough. Christine would always remain 12 in the memory of those who loved her. The world around her continued changing after 1984, but she could never change with it. Every technological breakthrough that helped solve her murder arrived after her life had already been taken. Every new investigative method came too late for her. Yet those methods eventually gave her story something it had been missing, a factual ending to the question of who was responsible. That ending also carried a warning for the future. Investigators must remain open to new evidence. Prosecutors must be willing to revisit old conclusions. Courts must recognize that convictions can be wrong, and evidence must be preserved even when its immediate value is uncertain. Christine's case demonstrated why those principles matter. The truth was not destroyed by the original mistakes. It was delayed. It remained inside the evidence, waiting for investigators to find a better way to reach it. 36 years after Christine disappeared, they finally did. The name Calvin Hoover closed the question of identity, but it did not close the emotional history of the case. The years of uncertainty remained. The wrongful conviction remained part of the record. The family's grief remained, and the lost life of a 12-year-old girl remained at the center of everything. The murder was solved, but nothing could make the world of 1984 return. What science could do was narrower and more powerful. It could separate truth from assumption. It could clear the innocent. It could identify the unknown. And after decades of silence, it could finally allow